Despite some difficulties, we had made it to the Gironde. We had visited the Cordouan Lighthouse, which was our goal, and decided it was well worth the effort. With our friend Sue, who joined us for a week, we had been up the river Charente to Rochefort to see the progress on the classic French frigate Hermione that was being built there. Now we could contemplate our return trip. We had adopted Terry Eagle's advice and travelled south down the islands in June, and we were planning to go north in July when the French were on holiday and swarm out to the islands, leaving space in the mainland marinas. We worked our way up the mainland shore, pausing in Morbihan, then working our way back toward Camaret and Brest, where we had another pause. Sadly, our usual plan, which would be to work along the North Brittany coast before crossing to the Solent, was trumped by the need for Dan to get back to Southampton to look after Betty, her mother, who was not well. So we went direct to Falmouth, where Dan hired a car to get back to Southampton. Later, I also went back to Southampton. How lucky we were that Anne and Mark were there in the Fal to keep an eye on our boat. After 3 weeks, I returned with Bob and Roy to get the boat back to Southampton by mid-September. We made it back to the Solent in good shape. Even at 0600, the temperature was 23 degrees centigrade. We were anchored south of Ile de Ré, having completed our expedition to the Cordouan Lighthouse. Ahead of us was the return voyage and several more experiences and adventures. We got underway under oily calm conditions. It was a tedious plug-under engine through the bridge and running the length of Ile de Ré, passing St Martin de Ré illuminated by the morning sun. Conditions were perfect to use our electric autopilot on the monitor self-steering. The course angled slightly toward the mainland coast. By 0830 we had passed Les Balineaux Light off the northern end of Ile de Ré Abîme. By 1100 we were alongside the visitors' pontoon in Bourgonais. We later learned that all the pontoons had been replaced, and I did find some pontoon debris abandoned in the car park. We had arrived at Bourgonais and rafted up on the outside of the visitors' pontoon until the harbour master arranged for us to move into a finger berth. It seemed that a major event was happening at Bourgonais. Eventually, some 60 yachts, flying flags and wearing decals, arrived. It was a classic example of French mooring machismo. The rules seemed to be: 1. When you enter a harbour, you must not display weakness by getting fenders or warps out of the locker. 2. Under no circumstances should you use springs or key lines. Believe it or not, these boats are supposed to be moored parallel to the long pontoon behind them. Boats were rafted 7 out in great banana-shaped rafts, with the outer boats being at 60 degrees to the pontoon. The poor mooring arrangements made leaving more difficult. The departure of the fleet between 0830 and 0900 on the third morning was quite exciting to watch. Why is it that with all the wonderful sail training that the French organise so well, they are absolutely incapable of mooring boats properly? The fleet left to go on to Les Sables d'Olonne. Shortly after the fleet departed, David and Val arrived in Mojito, the Rustler 36 we had last met in Saint-Denis. They had missed the mayhem and now had the entire visitors' pontoon to themselves. We were enjoying a few quiet days, having been on the move virtually every day since we had left St. Martin de Ré in company with Resting Goose. Ariadne had briefly crossed paths with Mojito in Saint-Denis, then the boats had gone separate ways for a while. This is the kind of cruising in company we like. By keeping in touch via SMS or occasionally Skype, we can see where a slight adjustment to plans makes a meet possible. On this occasion we had an excellent lunch ashore. I had had the advantage of a couple of mornings scouting around and had found a good boulangerie, several good restaurants, and, well out of town, the supermarket. In the course of this exploration, my opinion of Bourgonais had gone up. Our short previous visit had suggested that it was nothing more than a holiday camp, but dig a bit deeper and there is some quality there. At 09:20, Ariadne nosed out of Bourgonais using the leading marks to get safely offshore before hardening onto a beat. We were expecting a sea breeze to develop. We got the wind shift right on this day. A pattern is developing in this warm weather. Very early in the morning there is a sea breeze off the land as the air cools overnight. Then there is a calm period as the gradient wind takes over, typically from the northwest as it finds its way round the huge area of high pressure in the Atlantic. Then, just before midday, the sun heats the land to produce a sea breeze. By 1700 hours, the sea breeze has veered and is blowing at a brisk force 5 from the north or northwest, right on the nose. By leaving early, we could get to Les Sables d'Olonne before the wind was too brisk. Well, that was the theory. There is still evidence of damage in Les Sables from the winter storm Xynthia, but the port administration has clearly decided it will do all it can to accept visitors. After all, this is an iconic sailing port in France. Nevertheless, it must have been heartbreaking to see the damage, and it must have required heroic efforts to get it back together again. Once again, we left early to avoid the strong adverse sea breeze we expected in the afternoon. After motoring out to the Petite Barge buoy with the distinctive Grande Barge tower close by, we tried to sail, but the force 1 to 2 wind was insufficient to drive us through the slop left over from the previous day's sea breeze. 9 miles from Saint-Gilles, the first of the sea breeze began to appear. Almost drifting, we took a short tack out to sea, then straight to Saint-Gilles, using Malcolm Robson's safe clearing transit, as well as the plotter, to make sure we kept clear of the foul patch south of the harbour. The Naiad seemed to cope with the lop on the water better than we did, and this reinforced my feeling that maybe the time had come to get some new sails. Saint-Gilles has the clearest harbour transit I have ever seen. We were lucky and got a berth in the Port de la Ville Marina. When Mojito arrived later, they had to go onto the river berth where the tidal streams can be fierce. There is a very large market not far from the marina, and it was an excellent place to restock the boat. David and Val joined us for lunch at the marina restaurant where, as during our last visit, we enjoyed some very tasty palourdes farcies, absolutely reeking with garlic butter. We hoped that by leaving early at 0700, the last of the overnight land breeze would help us on our way. In the event, there was insufficient wind to sail until 09:30, when we were sufficiently clear of the coast. Mojito left about half an hour after us, and we saw her motoring northward straight into the breeze. They had decided to start their trip home and were making for Le Baudière. We were going back to Ile-Dieu, hoping to be better positioned for a passage across the mouth of the Loire. The feeble breeze died altogether until the first of the new sea breeze appeared from the north at 10:15. We were able to carry that breeze until we were under the lee of Ile-Dieu, after which we motored to Baie de la Vieille, where we anchored. Unfortunately, there was a slight swell working into the bay, so it was not sufficiently comfortable to stay overnight, which is what we had hoped. We wanted to avoid what promised to be a stuffy night in harbour. This was one of those rare days when we caught a mackerel, but only the one. It was supplemented by a tin of sardines for lunch. After lunch, the sea breeze was more established, so we had a pleasant beat up to Joinville, though there were a number of major wind shifts to cope with. In port, we were met by Brian Alexander, whose Rustler 42, Captain's Lady, was pausing on a passage south. We had a pleasant evening on board with Brian and Dawn. The weather was close, with thunder heard in the distance. During the following day we took a bus tour of the island, a trip we had done before, but it is an interesting place to explore. We particularly like the little harbour of La Meule. Joinville probably has the best poissonnerie on this coast. It was visited regularly. Just for one day, the wind was forecast to go into the west. This would be ideal for a reach across the Loire estuary. There would then be one more day of fairly settled weather to enable us to get round the corner to Piriac before a marked deterioration was expected. So it was disappointing to find a light northwesterly that would give us a beat when we left Joinville in company with a number of other boats, mainly motoring towards Noirmoutier. After sailing in the short lop of the sea for an hour, we gave up and motor sailed to windward, taking a long leg to the west once we were well north of Yeux. We were hoping that the wind would back into the west later. By 1100 we were motor sailing to the north with Ile Pilier in sight through the mist. Progress was disappointingly slow. The wind was slowly starting to back. By 12:30 the sea breeze was beginning to fill in from the west, the wind probably funneling up the Loire. This was more like it. Gradually the sheets were freed and the speed picked up as the wind freshened. By 13:15 we were at the Les Chevaux-Bois. Less than an hour later we were across the main fairway into the Loire and passing the La Banche Tourelle at about 3 miles. There was very little shipping about except for the moored tanker Algodabia and a few fishing vessels. We had reached Brittany and changed our courtesy flag again. We found our way through the line of rocks that shelters La Baule and Pornichet via the Passe des Trous. By 15:45 we were alongside in Pornichet, a port we had not visited before. It is a huge marina, a long walk to the Capitainery and at least another mile to the town, more than Dan or I wanted to tackle. Pornichet is a huge concrete jungle, rather like Benidorm with boats, not our kind of place at all. Ariadne would move on to Piriac the next day, so we just settled down on board, dug out the Ramoska and had a good meal. As we did not go ashore, Pornichet was just a passage stop. We had not yet really reached Brittany. A civilised 9 a.m. start in the hope of some breeze was not rewarded. We had to motor past La Baule, managed to drift slowly along the Le Croisic shore until the tide started to go foul. "30 minutes motoring got us round Point de Croisic, when we could again drift slowly past La Toubale goose-winged. There would be insufficient water to get into Piriac, which has a half-tide gate, so we opted for a lunch stop at Ile Dumay, which we reached at 13:20. As it was a weekend, and with the wind west-southwest, the bay was sheltered and there were numerous French boats there. There was still very little wind, so we weighed at 14:45 and trickled on a gentle breeze the 3.5 miles to Piriac. Out of interest, we were able to identify Robson's leading marks, though the channel is sufficiently well marked with the balises. Piriac has a half-tide sill that is lowered as soon as it is covered, giving a wide entry window across the top of the tide. The weather was set to go downhill later in the week, so we were pleased to be in one of our favourite ports. Now we could relax for a few days and enjoy Brittany. Having got to Piriac, that wonderful town of flowers, we enjoyed a few days' rest while the weather went badly downhill. The night we arrived, we expected a Grand Frère, that is Force 7, with some rain too. Bastille Day fireworks in Piriac were postponed until the Sunday because of the forecast. We had been getting along quite well, so a few days' rest was welcome. Piriac market is one of the best, though it seems that even the French are having to come into line with EU standards. Open fish stalls in the street are giving way to large market halls like this one, where fresh water and good hygiene can be easily maintained. It was a gentle lifestyle, with a good boulangerie and tabac for the newspaper West France, both close to the marina. A gentle stroll through the village to the market was a regular event, for moules, crab, crevette, beautiful white fish, fresh vegetables, and the occasional naughty but nice pâtisserie. Now and again we would stop at a pavement cafe and watch the world go by. Over the next couple of days we could watch the grey sea outside the harbour. Very few boats went out. It was rough, but it must have been wild to the west. The whole Gulf of Quiberon is just a gigantic playpen for yachts, with Presqu'île de Quiberon acting as a breakwater against the Atlantic swell. On the 15th, the forecast for Yeux and Rochebonne was west to southwest 5 to 6, occasionally 7 at first, becoming south or southwest 5 to 7, occasionally 8 in the northwest. Severe gusts, very rough at times, sea high in the west with a cross sea. Rain becoming showery with thunder. On the VHF we heard Cross Corsen attending a number of yachts in distress, including one that stranded in the entrance to the Morbihan. Later we learned that this was our friend Roy Dowman and his boat Aswas. Fortunately no one was hurt and the damage to the boat was superficial, but Aswas, which is a westerly fulmar, was hauled out at Port Navalo for a good check over. Roy ran out of time and set off back towards Lorient the day before we headed over to Morbihan. The weather started to moderate a little by the 16th, which was sunny, but still blowing fairly hard from the wrong direction for us. On one day the tides were huge, reaching to only 3/4 of a metre below the quay level. The passerelle was horizontal. We had been in Piriac for almost a week and thoroughly enjoyed our stay. After nearly a week in Piriac, mainly due to adverse weather, we were suffering from harbour rot, but it was a glorious sunny day and Quiberon Peninsula isolated us from the Atlantic swell, so a beat of 20 miles did not seem too daunting. It was a sparkling afternoon sail. It is pleasant to be warm when beating. After passing south of Ile Dumay to avoid a buoyed restricted area, we reefed as the breeze freshened. Two tacks, Ariadne had almost laid into Morbihan except for a final short hitch to clear the reef between Les Pieux and St Gildas buoys. Thereafter we could free the sheets and get the boat going fast. This was just as well as we were a bit early and still had 2 knots against us in the entrance. We were creaming along at 6.5 knots through the water, so all was well. The tides are fierce in many places in the Morbihan, but we had been shown a peaceful anchorage just inside the entrance behind Grand Vezid Island, where there is shelter from the wind, just sufficient water with good holding, and very benign tidal streams. We regard this almost as our private anchorage, and there were only 2 boats there when we arrived, and they both left before dusk, although a couple more arrived for the night. Very peaceful. It was the first time that we had departed to the south from our anchorage behind Grand Vezid. Once the bow pushed south of Ile Longue, the flooding tide grabbed us and we were doing 9 knots over the ground. There were great swells in the water near Jumeaux as we headed towards the southern tip of Ile aux Moines. A sharp turn to port, and then we headed across the shallows till we were past the Leuf shoal. By midday we were anchored southeast of Ile d'Az, where we had arranged to meet Mojito, who had been up to Vannes. For us this was a new anchorage. Mojito arrived and anchored nearby. David and Val had used this anchorage before and gave us useful tips on where to land and where the shops were. The next morning I went ashore to explore the village and find the boulangerie. Following David's guidance, I wandered through the trees near the beach, past the village pump, and then past the church to the centre of the village. This is a remote, sleepy island, and not a lot was open at first, so I went for a stroll to find out the lay of the land. Ile d'Az is narrow, so it is quite easy to walk across and get good views across to the mainland. There are some fascinating archaeological sites on the island, but they involved a lot of walking. So when Dan came ashore with me later in the morning, we concentrated on getting to the village and seeing the key things. We had a good lunch ashore in a garden restaurant before going back on board to relax for the rest of the day. It was late morning when there was sufficient water to make our way over the shallows to the north of Ile d'Az. We could then swing round into the narrow channel up to Vannes. We were at the bridge early, so had to join other yachts on the waiting pontoon. Eventually, the bridge opened and we proceeded to an allocated berth, only to find another boat had taken it. After a while, we were reallocated a berth much nearer the town, which saved Dan a lot of walking. We had hoped we would meet up with Roddy and Claudine, also Russell owners, so we were delighted when they came on board and then invited us to lunch the next day at their flat right next to the marina. Lunch started in a bar with a pression at 11:30 and then proceeded at their flat with an hors d'oeuvre of prawns, followed by a huge platter of langoustine and a couple of spider crabs. Then came lieu jaune, followed by cheese, then strawberries doused in cream. Claudine is an excellent cook and she had carefully chosen wines to suit each course. We got back aboard at 19:30. It was quite an experience. The lock gate would open in the late afternoon, so we had a pleasant morning strolling round Vannes. By text, we had arranged to link up with Derek Ide, who was cruising single-handed in his Fulmar Fearless. Following his recommendation, we dropped down the canal from Vannes and passed north of Ile aux Moines to an anchorage off Ile Bedre. There was a strong headwind, but the ebbing tide assisted. With the PC chart plotter on the hatch, pilotage was straightforward. There are so many islands that it would be easy to get lost. There were some fascinating sights during this short passage. The anchorage was close to the point in Morbihan with the strongest currents, but seemed to be slightly to one side of the stream. Already at the anchorage was Festina Lenti, a Sigma 38 that had just completed an Atlantic triangle with Philip and Linda Meekins on board. Derek had met them before, so it was quite a jolly party in Ariadne's saloon. Derek, Philip and I decided to go for a walk around the island. Ile Bedre is privately owned, but the public are invited to land. To the south, the views are of narrow channels with fast-flowing currents. To the north, there is a low-tide causeway to the nearby village of Lamorbaden. It is pleasant walking through the pine woods. There is even a chapel on the island. During the walk back along the shore, we found these wrecks. What's their story? Is it something simple like decommissioning of fishing vessels forced by the EU? Or is it something more romantic? It's fun to speculate. This was another part of Morbihan that we had not seen before, and another excellent anchorage. Fearless was still headed south, and we had never visited Penarth, so we agreed to sail there in company, even though it was a slight backtrack for us. There was a mass of weed on the first 10 metres of the anchor chain when we weighed, mid-morning. By then the tide was well away. As we nosed into the stream, we were almost flung out of the Morbihan with speed over the ground exceeding 10 knots for a short while. Once outside, we found a northeast 3 to 4 breeze that gave a good broad reach to clear the Morbihan. A jibe onto port tack enabled us to follow the coast towards Penarth. With the coast blocking the breeze, both boats motor-sailed for a while. As we hardened up towards Penarth, we were able to sail again until we identified the oddly named Tour Anglais. Then, rolling headsails, we followed Fearless along the tricky transit. It is a long channel up to the town. Only one mooring was free, which we picked up. Fearless came alongside, à couple. After lunch, the tide turned, and the wind against the strong outgoing stream made rafting the boats unsafe, so Derek dropped away and found another empty buoy a quarter of a mile upriver. The whole area is low-lying with little shelter from the breeze that had now freshened considerably. We opted to wait until the next day to explore the village. There is not a lot of Penarth, but we all went ashore for a stroll around. We found a poissonnerie where we bought some mussels, and Derek selected the oysters. It is a small, pretty village to stroll around. A very sleepy place. This side of the Morbihan, known as Presqu'île de Ris, is very much out of the way. Fishing and holiday homes seem to be its future. A lazy coffee at the bistro, where one could also buy some bread and the paper. We looked in at the church, then went back aboard Ariadne. It was mules for lunch and oysters for supper, followed by a spag bog. In addition to the oysters, Derek provided some bubbly, a jolly evening. Derek had moved again to an empty buoy just ahead of Ariadne, so it was not too far to row. We had enjoyed a few days in company. Derek wanted to go on to Piriac the next day, whereas we decided to attempt a trip to Huat before rounding the Quiberon Peninsula. After a couple of nights in Penarth, Derek went on to Piriac in Fearless, while we set out for Huat, one of the islands that form the southern barrier of the great natural playpen that is the Baie de Quiberon. The forecast was northwest 3 to 4, occasionally 5. Sadly, the wind was not quite as forecast, never veering past westerly, and the tide was slightly adverse. It would have been a long, hard beat in the prevailing chop, even though it was sunny, so we motor-sailed for 3 hours. A pity, because it was a sparkling sailing day, but the motion would have been a bit harsh on Dan's back as the wind freshened to nearly force 5. We were not surprised to hear that Fearless had had a storming reach to Piriac. We like Huat, so do the French. There were over 100 boats anchored in the bay at the eastern end of the island. With the wind firmly in the west and little chance of a vent solaire, the local land breeze that blows hard northeast in the small hours, the water was flat, and it seemed as secure an anchorage as one would wish. We spent the next morning ashore pottering about the village. It is always such a clean and fresh looking place, obviously totally dependent on holiday traffic. On the way back, we invited Graham and Angela from a British Beneteau called Atlantis to join us for a happy hour in the late afternoon. We were resting after lunch when we realised that a French single-hander that had anchored just ahead of Atlantis had dragged and the boats were grinding against each other. I rowed over to assist but was not able to contribute much. Then the wretched Frenchman moved and anchored dead ahead of us. Clearly he was not using enough scope for the stiff breeze. After a lot of hand-waving and shouting, he moved elsewhere. Towards the evening, we could see low cloud blowing over the south end of the island. During the night, the wind moderated and it was peace once more. The weather maps continued to look benign, but we wanted to get round the corner to Lorient while the weather was gentle because the prevailing wind continued to be west or northwest, almost dead on the nose. As we left the Huat anchorage to the north, what had started out as a pleasant morning disappeared into a bank of fog. This would be a day of navigating by electronic chart plotter backed up by radar, and for almost the only time south of the Raz, the AIS which kept track of the high-speed vedettes. This was all we saw of Port St Gildas, but we could hear the vedettes charging in and out at speed. Using the Beniguet passage would have involved a big diversion, but by keeping north of the reefs, we could join the Teigneurs passage near the Basse du Milieu buoy. This Tourelle emerged from the fog and was about the only mark we saw all morning. After Port Maria, the visibility improved. There was little breeze except for the last 5 miles of the trip as we entered Lorient. As we entered Lorient, we saw Tim Slessor sailing Hobo and arranged to meet him a couple of days later. The new marina berths at Port Louis are a major improvement. The Wi-Fi at €3 per day is of high quality, so we can avoid cricket on Radio 4 longwave. There is nothing special about Port Louis, and therein lies its attraction. It is a low-key, genuine little town. We were able to stroll around, replenish stores, and visit the boulangerie and charcuterie that we had used in previous years. It was like slipping on a favourite sweater. We found a cave there that was offering a very good deal on Bordeaux and Entre deux Mers, so a dozen of each was shipped. Across the estuary we could see the submarine pens that remind one of some of the history of this place, though the museum in Fort Louis is probably more important as it reflects French influence throughout the Far East over a long period. We also saw Tabally's Penduic making sail. Tim Slessor collected us and took us to his cottage for a couple of nights. It was a delightful interlude of intellectual stimulation and good food in relaxing surroundings. Late morning was the time to leave to work the tidal stream. After motoring clear of Lorient, it was a gentle beat in flat water under grey skies. At first the peace was disturbed by the ferries charging between Lorient and Port Tudy on the Ile de Grace. Thereafter there were only a few yachts and the occasional fishing boat. We passed inshore of Les Verts, a tourelle marking a reef, then worked our way into the Rivière de Bellon. By 1700 we were moored fore and aft off the village. The buoy spacing is tight for a 36-foot boat, but we managed. We had a lay day in Bellon. The weather was not conducive to pushing on, so we just rested. On the day after our arrival, we went ashore for a seafood lunch at the bistro. No, it may not have been the very expensive fish restaurant on the other side of the river, but look at this platter. After 2 relaxing nights in Bellon, conditions were docile, so we decided to make for the Baie de la Forêt. We motored gently clear of the river past the Port Manic light. Our interest for the day was the basse de vitesse that Malcolm Robson identifies in Volume 3 of his French Pilot. If you have ever wondered why those huge tourelles were built in the Isle of Glenor, he says, or what was the purpose of the various amers, little tourelles, scattered along the coast, the mystery can now be explained. All those amers and balises between Ile de Glenor and Ile de Grace, obviously of no navigational use, are marks for measured distances as shown on the chart. The nearby naval base at Lorient must have had a field day during the 19th century setting up the marks. They are still painted regularly, so you can settle that argument about your vessel's speed. We could only see the cross transits. The main transit for the speed test track depends on amers on Ile de Grace and Ile de Glenor, nearly 15 miles apart, none of which were visible in the haze. On the previous day we had been too close inshore to identify the transit at Doylen. We had seen the large amer at Querman as we turned into Bellon. Having made sail after leaving Bellon, we had a gentle beat along the coast, passing close to Point de Raguenez and inside Ile Verte, where we could see 2 more of the basse de vitesse amers identified by Robson. After rounding the Point de Trevignan, the wind headed from south-southwest to west-northwest just after the Les Soldats Tourelles and became very shifty. We were not in a hurry, so we tacked on the shifts until the new wind filled in from west-southwest, giving us a fast-reaching passage into Baie de la Forêt. It was Sunday, so nothing would be open in Concarneau, so we decided to anchor off Begmeel for the night. It was quiet once the breeze died in the evening. Next morning we motored across to Concarneau, picking up the long transit described by Robson and taking note of this curious building which contains a sectored light in the top window for a night approach. We were moored on the inside of the breakwater pontoon, so it was quite a walk to the market and the old walled town. Concarneau was its usual touristy self, but we managed to restock, visit the market and the old town, where Dan found some more Christmas presents. Now we are anticipating a bit of a downturn in the weather, so progress would be flexible for a while. But at least we were stocked to be away from marinas for several days if necessary. Some years ago, we were on passage from Lochtudi to Bellon, passing just to the north of Île-aux-Moutons, which lies northwest of the Ile de Glenon. We had considered it as a passage stop for lunch, but it does not rate even a mention in Adlard Cole's North Biscay pilot, and even Malcolm Robson only shows a diagram of the lighthouse with no supporting pilotage notes. Cumberledge has a brief reference in Secret Anchorages of Brittany, but it does not cover the best anchorage. So we were surprised to see that quite a substantial fleet was sheltering in the lee of the island. I noted on the chart local anchorage and resolved to explore it another year. The only English language pilot I could find that referred to the island is Sailing Tours Part 3 Falmouth to the Loire, first published in 1894. William Cowper's pilotage instructions can be a little quaint, but his descriptions of the locations he visited are memorable. Of Île-aux-Moutons he writes, "It is a curious little settlement this, with no post, no railway, no steamboat, hardly any regular communication with the rest of the world, but yet a more jovial, jolly old fellow than the guardian of the lighthouse I never saw. The whole domain may be about 1.5 acres of grass, yet on this a cow is kept. How the poor beast lives I do not know, for the grass, having hardly any soil, was well withered and burnt up." And it goes on in like vein, including pointing out that there are no sheep on the island. This year the chance to visit Île-aux-Moutons had arrived. We were in Concarneau and decided that the prospect of a deterioration in the weather made our plan to visit the Ile de Glenon unattractive, so we resolved to hide up the Odet beyond Benaudet instead. That was only a short passage. With flat water and a force-to breeze, we saw the opportunity for a lunch stop on the way at Île-aux-Moutons. In the distance we could see Les Glenons, with various vessels, including a training ship, sailing gently in the bay. With the wind slightly south of west, the bay on the north side was protected. There were a few yachts and a couple of small motorboats, all tucked in among the rocks. We tacked up to the bay, dropped sail and motored in to anchor in 3 meters over sand and some weed. It's a pleasant spot, well protected from the swell. We had arrived at about 12:45, and over the next hour about 20 dayboats, ribs and motorboats arrived, mainly from the direction of Benaudet, so it is obviously a popular spot. It is a pity that this delightful anchorage is not better known to British yachtsmen. We had a relaxing lunch there and just enjoyed the scenery. Quite a lot of people had gone ashore, but we did not do so. After leaving Île-aux-Moutons, a gentle reach brought us into Benaudet, where we could pick out the numerous lighthouses and leading marks. Once in the river, it was a matter of following the moorings until we could turn into the Anse de Cambrai and anchor. The weather map for the 4th showed that we would be under the end of an occlusion, and so it turned out, with low cloud and rain. We just sat it out. On the 5th of August, the weather did not encourage a long passage. We cruised up the Odet till we could see Quimper, which we had not done before. It was a gentle sail to Loch Tudi, where we would be well placed to go round Penmar the next day. It was a grey, still morning when we motored out of Loch Tudi at 07:20. As so often in the past, it was a long plug round Penmar, ticking off the buoys. Billienne, Basse Boulanger, Carrick-Grise, Argusti, Spinnig, Cap Caval. The lighthouses of Penmar seemed to walk along the coast, keeping pace with us. By midday we were past Cap Caval and could shut down the engine while squaring away onto a broad reach. It was a long, slow flop across the bay. By 1500 we were on a buoy in Cordouan. For some reason we have never been ashore at Cordouan, and this was no exception. We treat it as a passage stop. That is probably unfair on the town. It was now a lot colder. Long trousers and fleeces were dug out of lockers. On the way from Cordouan under engine through the Raz de Seine, the forecast was for crachin, drizzle, so waterproof trousers and boots were de rigueur, and we were not even in the channel. The Raz is an imposing feature that demands respect. On this occasion the water was flat, so we were able to boat around fairly close to the Lavier Lighthouse and the La Platte Tourelle. It took a long time to handrail round, with the aspect constantly changing. The next leg was a reach toward Cap de la Chèvre. The swell disappeared as soon as we were behind Cap de la Chèvre. The wind direction meant that one of our favourite anchorages, the Anse de Saint-Arnaud, would be sheltered. It is the hook of rock at the south end of the Anse de Saint-Arnaud, clearly visible in the Google aerial photo, that makes it such a good anchorage when the winds are in the west or further north. It is just a wee daunder along the coast to Morgat. The only interesting pilotage is to identify the rather attractive lighthouse on the cliff top. In Morgat we found lovely new marina pontoons. It was not the first time we had been here for my birthday, so we knew exactly which restaurant we wanted. We started with a lovely dish of pétanque farci, absolutely swimming in garlic butter, followed by steak which we cooked ourselves at the table on a hot stone. Morgat is a lovely holiday destination tucked away from the mainstream. Not for the first time, we enjoyed our brief stay here. It began to look as if the weather was breaking down for a while. Plans to visit Ile de Seine were abandoned, and we decided to move round to Camaret to sit it out. A gentle beat in the late morning towards Cap de la Chèvre, the wind being forced to from the south. Rounding the headland was tricky because of a fierce tidal eddy. The reward was that thereafter we had a gentle reach toward the Tas des Pois. This passage can be deceptive, as there are a few growlers on the way that need to be spotted and avoided. It was convenient to go between the rocks, so we did. Then gently along the coast, passing inside the Toulonguet rocks. Next we turned the corner and, almost drifting, entered Camaret. As we made fast, it clouded over. We didn't mind, we had had a good day's sailing. We were happy to spend a day or two in Camaret to restock, visit the poissonnerie and see what the weather would do.
Merci.
The tidal coefficient, which the French used to relate tidal range against a standard 100 at Brest, was due to be 108, a very big spring tide. Most impressive were the low tides. The weather showed no sign of improving, so we planned to go over to the new marina in Brest so that we could explore the maritime museums that Malcolm Robson had praised in his pilot books. The new marina is very close to the chateau, so it is now accessible to us, especially to Dan. After a couple of relaxing days in Camaret, with plenty of excellent seafood, we needed to decide where to go next. With a few days of brisk north to northwesterlies in prospect, it seemed like a good opportunity to try out the new Marina du Château in Brest. As we left, we passed the tour which dominates the harbour of Camaret. It was one of Vauban's earliest structures when he was assigned the task of defending Brest against a British raid. It was his only field command, but he went on to build many more forts along what would be the First Atlantic Wall. Interestingly, the Battle of Camaret in 1694 is the only sea battle against the British which the French won decisively. We headed across Camaret Bay towards the Petit Minou Lighthouse on the north shore of the Goulet de Brest. The Goulet is a narrow natural channel that connects Brest and the huge Rade de Brest to the sea. The tides run strongly throughout its length. Speed over the ground reached 10 knots at times. Fetching in through the Goulet de Brest, the sense of history is almost oppressive. Strange structures, mostly with a defensive purpose, can be seen all along the coast. Everywhere you look there are defensive structures, some placed there by Vauban and some built for Hitler. Interestingly, most were built to keep the British out. Passing the tall lighthouse on Pointe de Portzic, the huge Rade de Brest opened before us. It is larger than Milford Haven, Poole Harbour and the Morbihan added together, a huge natural harbour. Then, after passing the huge German submarine base and what looks like a naval academy, we started looking for the harbour entrance. It was the next morning that we climbed up the steps to the Musée des Marins at the Château, just above the marina. It is the French equivalent of Greenwich, and the building itself has a fascinating history dating back to Roman times. The Château building was interesting, and some of the displays were intriguing, but we both ranked the museum at Port Louis, which deals with the French development of the Orient, as being better. From the top of the chateau we could see the Tour Tanguy, the municipal museum on the other side of the River Penfield. There were more exhibits as we worked our way back down through the chateau. Never mind, it was a great experience, but a bit of an ordeal for Dan. We stopped at a small port restaurant on the way back and ate too much. The restaurant specialised in rich meat dishes. Ours was a lamb hock, very fatty and full of flavour, with vegetables, gravy and great chunks of bread. Dan slept all afternoon and evening to recover. Our long climb to the chateau had been fascinating, but it left Dan exhausted, so I was on my own when I visited the other nearby museum, the Tour Tanguy, the next day. It is quite a good walk after climbing back up to the level of the chateau. The route takes you over the lifting bridge. This bridge is a replacement for one that had been built in post-Napoleonic times and which served the city well for over a century. However, failed Allied attempts to destroy the submarine pens resulted in the city and the bridge being destroyed. The replacement bridge and the concrete buildings thrown up to replace the town centre make Brest a functional but not very beautiful city, but the site has been fought over since Roman times. The Tour Tanguy is a small 14th century tower that houses the municipal account of the town history. Interesting, but not very extensive. On the way back, I discovered that heading from the marina towards the commercial port leads to several restaurants, a good boulangerie and an excellent poissonnerie, as well as a huge open-air theatre that pounds out music till the late evening. Even during the day, there was a carnival atmosphere in the marina area. The weather was still unsettled, but we decided to return to Camaret and link up with Rafiki and Fearless, two westerlies that we had got to know during our earlier visit. It was a straightforward reach in a stiff breeze. It gave us a chance to look more carefully at the submarine pens and the rather strange white ship in the harbour. I later discovered that she was called Bem Monge and was a sort of French spook ship used for satellite and missile tracking among other exotic tasks. Leaving the Goulet, one rounds a small island linked to the shore by a bridge. Clearly it had been reinforced as an advanced lookout post in years gone by. Coming alongside the marina berth in Camaret in the fresh breeze was tricky, and the assistance of the other two boats was greatly appreciated. During the 15th of August we just socialised with Rafiki and Fearless. The weather remained persistently from a northerly quadrant, so there was no enthusiasm for going on through the Canal de Phare. Rafiki and Fearless were suffering from harbour rot. On the 16th we woke to thick fog. It soon burned off as we set out to cruise in company round the corner to escape the unsettled weather. The destination was Phare, a little village tucked in a corner of the vast Rade de Brest. For the passage, Dan went with Chris in Rafiki, while Chris's daughter Elizabeth sailed Ariadne with me. Elizabeth was delighted to sail a Rustler and managed it very well. It was almost adrift with the tide through the Goulet de Brest. It became a fast reach once we were able to jibe and head past the French nuclear submarine base at Ile Longue, where Marines in black wetsuits observe you from a distance in high-speed ribs. Eventually we rounded up well sheltered in Phare, an anchorage that had been first recommended to me by David Cahoon when we were cruising in company with Santana. Amazingly, Elizabeth and Jerome, her younger brother, both leapt into the water as soon as we were anchored. Studying the weather patterns, we saw that there would be a brief period of settled weather on Wednesday, followed by an extended period of unsettled weather, so we decided to move on the next morning to La Brie-le-Duc and cross the channel to Falmouth from there the next day. Rafiki and Fearless chose to wait for a better weather window. We said farewell to Rafiki and Fearless, who decided to wait for a better opportunity to move north. The visibility was very bad and we needed AIS to keep clear of a number of patrol boats, one of which we later realised was carrying out a minesweeping exercise. It was a lumpy beat in poor visibility through the Goulet de Brest, with wind against tide kicking up a sea. We beat along the shore towards Point St. Matthew. The ebb was running down the Canal du Phare, so would be against us. Under power, we passed inside Les Vieux-Moines reef to gain the advantage of an eddy as we rounded Point St. Matthew. The visibility slowly improved. It was a gentle reach up the Canal du Phare. The tide was still against us, but very neap, so apart from a short stretch off Le Conquet where we had to motor, the tidal effect was not significant. We arced round toward La Brie-aux-Deux using the Le Lieu Tourelle as a useful reference. The tiny white lighthouse helps to identify the entrance, which is well marked by balises. By 1730 we were moored in La Brie-aux-Deux. Our friend Di telephoned from Southampton to say that Dan's mother was very unwell. At 91 the signs were not good. We could return to Brest, go on to La Bavrac or go across the channel to Falmouth. The weather window we had spotted earlier made the last of these choices the quickest way to get Dan home, so we planned an early start for the next morning. On the Wednesday morning at first light we were away, motoring in a very light southwest wind. To the east we could see Le Phare silhouetted against the rising sun. To the west we could just make out the Le Stif observation tower on Ile d'Ouessant. As we pulled away from the coast, looking east again, we could just make out the Ile Vierge lighthouse silhouetted against the dawn. What we did not know is that this would probably be our last channel crossing in Ariadne. After 5 hours we encountered a line squall. The wind shifted and settled into the west, slowly freshening through the day to reach about force 5. We were making good speed under full sail, the true wind being just south of west. At 1100, still well south of the main shipping lanes, we encountered Pride of Bilbao hammering southwestward, obviously cutting the corner on her way to Santander. We were surprised that she was not obliged to use the traffic separation scheme. We encountered the shipping lanes aligned to the Ushant TSS at about midday. There was quite a lot of activity. The AIS was invaluable in making sure there would be no close encounters. For several hours we were in company with Rockbottom, who came up astern motor sailing, then sailed for a while. Conditions were fresh with the lumpy sea. On the VHF we learned that they had come from Brest and were trying to make Foy, so in the late afternoon they restarted their engine and gradually pulled away again. As the sun started to go down, the wind freshened to force 6. We had had 11 hours of fast reaching, which took us almost to the Manacles Buoy, after which we motored on a flat sea, anchoring in Falmouth at about midnight. We motored up to the Falmouth Marina at Penryn the next morning. The hire car company made a special effort to make a one-way car available for Dan. She set off to Southampton late morning. Effectively, that was the end of our cruise. I took Ariadne up to the Rouen pontoon and left her in the safe hands of Anne and Mark, while I also returned to Southampton. There was a coda to the voyage. With the help of Bob Comley and Roy Dowman, I returned to Falmouth and brought Ariadne back to the Solent. On the first evening, we dropped down to the Helford to give us a better sailing angle for the trip to the Russell Rally in Foy. There was a short stopover in the Dart where we met Chris and Angie Cohen, who had recently cruised extensively in the Atlantic. Then we made a long passage direct round Portland into the Solent. After Anvil Point it became a dead run in the gathering night as we hurtled towards Hurst. The monitor wind vane coped well. We just made the tide at Hurst and anchored behind the spit till morning. It was then a wee dawnder back to Marchwood. The whole round trip had covered 1,546 miles.